Paradoxically, it is the very time when you're busy at work that you should make time to do the things that you enjoy that enable you to rest and recover.
So, probably a good place to start is with a bit of the science. So, what actually causes chronic stress?
So I think we can think about chronic stress as an accumulation of a series of acute stress events. I mean, it's not solely that, but if we think about stress as being a normal and necessary response, that it is a response to a threat or a demand in the environment, and we get, these biological changes that you would have covered in your previous podcasts, where we get the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol. It's there to help us deal with what we see in the environment. Now, in terms of how we make sense of the world and how we decide whether something is a stressor, then the brain and particularly the role of appraisal is crucial in that. And when we think about situations that might be perceived as stressful, if I give you some examples of why they might be perceived as stressful, I'll draw on the work of Jim Blaskovich in this regard. So there might be situations where there's uncertainty, we don't know what's going to happen. There might be situations where there's the perception of danger. Now, that could be physical danger, but often for lots of us in our life, it's about evaluation. And so being evaluated negatively, or the potential to be evaluated negatively, is a potential source. And also, we have perceptions of effort. So if it's a situation where I'm going to have to do, exert a lot of effort and perform quite well to be able to manage the demands I'm faced with, and that can be a source of stress for us. So when we evaluate situations based on how we make sense of them, then that can lead on to a particular stress response. In short, these are situations that are important to us, either for our own well-being or potentially for our status. So Lazarus talks about stressful situations, the appraisal of stressful situations, as are they meaningful to us and do they help us make progress towards a specific goal? That is, whether that's survival or whether that's a particular status enhancing situation. So appraisal and the way we make sense of the world is key to the stress response. And those are some of the factors that create the stressor, if you like, that we then try to make sense of. And then the next stage is really about our resources or our perceptions of our ability to cope with what we see in that environment. So you might go into a very difficult or demanding situation and have confidence in your ability to cope. Believe that you have control over the situation or your skills to be able to execute them well. You might believe and be focused on what you have to do well. In contrast, I might go into the same situation lacking confidence, thinking that how I'm going to do is related to factors outside of my control, and also be really focused on not messing up and be worried about making mistakes. And so you can see how the same situation, the same demand is perceived differently by different people depending on the perception of resources they have going into that situation.
So, clearly, people perceive things very, very differently, don't they? And respond to things very, very differently. What are some of the reasons behind that?
Well, the reasons behind that could fill a series of podcasts, Owen. They are many and they are varied and they range from personality. So people high on neuroticism will typically have higher levels of anxiety in a stressful situation. People with levels of conscientiousness will typically have lower levels and respond and adapt better to stressful situations. So we have personality, we have our psychological skills and our perceptions of our confidence and control that might have an influence. So people who are more confident, have higher perceived control, will typically have more adaptive stress responses. Um, People make sense of the way they respond to stress differently. So if we think about the stress responses and some of the experiences that we might experience, so things like an increased heart rate, butterflies in the stomach, you might interpret those, Owen, as actually showing that you're up for this particular task. The body is ready to help you perform to your potential or to help you manage the demands that you're faced with. I might see those exact same responses as being something that indicates, Mark, you're getting nervous. You're getting stressed in that situation. You're never going to be able to manage that. People interpret their biology differently. So we have this interaction between our cognitive state and our biological state. What other factors have an impact on stress? We talked about personality. We talked about appraisals. They relate to social factors as well. So we have, people who feel socially connected to those around them are better able to manage the demands and the stresses that they are faced with. Some of our lifestyle factors also play a role, and sleep is a really good example of both how it might be affected by levels of stress. So, people experiencing high levels of chronic stress might have difficulty going to sleep and having good quality sleep, but also our level and our amount and quality of sleep has an impact on our ability to respond to and manage the stresses that we experience in subsequent days. I could talk a bit about that if you wanted details. So there are many varied factors that cover our personality, that cover our psychological skills, that cover our lifestyle factors. And of course, all of this builds on our past experiences that we would have had in comparable situations that mean that we might respond in different ways to the demands, the threats, and the stresses that we might face.
Fantastic. So, if I get this right, we've got threats, pressures, and demands. We've got our own personal, unique perception of that, which will affect the response, I guess. But then you've got, I think you alluded to it, am I right? Then your own unique personal sense of control over that potential demand. And people do this differently, don't they? You put two people in a situation and one will thrive and one will crumble. So, what's going on with control?
So, if I just pick up on the concept of thrive and crumble and talk about some of the work that we've done at Manchester Metropolitan University, where we've really been interested in exploring the particular nuances of the stress response that indicate whether someone is challenged by it, the thriving, or whether someone is threatened by it, the crumbling. And we measure these particular nuanced aspects of the stress response using cardiovascular reactivity. So, very simply, as a methodology, I would bring you into the laboratory, Owen. I would get you nice and relaxed. And then, using a finger cuff, I would measure two particular aspects of cardiovascular reactivity that I'm interested in. One is cardiac output, which is the amount of blood that goes to the heart over a minute. And the other is peripheral vascular resistance, which is the constriction or dilation of the blood vessels. And there are particular patterns of cardiac output and peripheral vascular resistance that indicate whether someone is challenged or threatened. So if you imagine coming into the lab, we get you nice and relaxed, Owen, and then we would ask you to do a particular task. That task might be to give a short speech to someone. It might be to do a cognitive task on a computer where you're competing against other people. We've collected data on professional cricketers who've gone out to play, the same with professional footballers. It could be to go and do a physical task, like a climbing task when you've never climbed before. It could be anything. But the thing that connects those is that they put you under stress. Now, we're measuring your physical responses. And if we see little or no change in cardiac output and an increase in vascular resistance because the blood vessels constrict, that's a threat response. If we see an increase in cardiac output and a decrease in vascular resistance because the blood vessels dilate, that's a challenge response. And the important point about this methodology is that we're able to measure in a laboratory setting whether someone is likely to thrive or likely to crumble, whether they're challenged or whether they're threatened, whether they have that positive eustress or that negative distress. Both of those responses are perfectly helpful, but they serve different purposes. So they're not helpful in terms of performance. The challenge response is an approach response. It's there to say, well, okay, I'm a bit nervous, I'm a bit stressed here, but you know what? I'm going to give it a go. A threat response is more of an avoidance response. I've been asked to do something, but I'm not so sure about this. Consistently over our data, and others have demonstrated the same, those individuals who are challenged will perform better at task, whether that's a professional football game, a cricket task, netball, cognitive task, that those individuals who respond in a challenged way will perform better. Now, you talked about control. Why did I talk about challenge and threat and perceptions of control? Control is one of those factors that we think is important in determining whether someone will respond in a challenged way compared to a threat way. We talk about control as well as confidence and an approach focus, but certainly control seems to be key. That when we feel as though we have perceptions of control in a difficult, demanding, stressful situation, we are then able to respond more positively, perform, and function better. And if we go back to what we think chronic stress is, this accumulation of repeated bouts of acute stress, we think that responding in a challenged way is better over time for levels of chronic stress, both in terms of the physiology, dilation of blood vessels rather than constriction, but also in terms of the experience of stress that people would have over time. So it's a better stress response to be challenged than it is to be threatened. And control is an important part of that.
So, what are some of the things that impact our sense of control?
Yeah, so if I start off with an example from the laboratory and some of the research that we've done, and then I'll give some more practical examples that we use with user clients across lots of different settings, whether they're organizational, sport, or whatever it might be. So I'll talk about the laboratory one just because it's simple. And I'll give an illustration that perhaps might be helpful. So we had two groups of participants, and they were about to do a climbing task, and they were novice climbers. So climbing up a 10-meter climbing wall was stressful for them. And we gave them a set of instructions about the climbing task, and we just manipulated three sentences in those instructions. So one group were reminded, simply being reminded, that they had control over which holes they would choose, whereas the other group were told that it was just luck that they would choose the right holes, was one of the variations that we had. Now, we did other things as well associated with that. So we built up their confidence with a sentence. We talked about, try your best to get as high up the wall versus try your best not to fall off the wall. That was the threat one. But the people who were emphasized control had a challenge response compared to those people who had a threat response. So actually, the instructions that we give people, reminding them that they have autonomy, that they have control over the choices that they make, can be a helpful strategy. In terms of some of the applied work that we do, where we work with different groups or different organizations, a colleague of mine, Dr. Martin Turner, has developed a control map that's actually been quite helpful. And on this control map, we will have people to think about what's important to them. And that could be health, it could be performance. And they place this on the center of a large A3 piece of paper. And then what we do is we ask them to think about the factors that have an impact on health or have an impact on functioning, have an impact on performance. And they place those factors on this piece of paper. And then they will place those factors that they have control over closer to the health or performance issue in the middle, whatever it is that they're focused on. And for those factors that are outside of their control, we then get them to reflect on those and to think about perhaps how they can bring them into their sphere of control. Are there some things that you can do that can have an influence on this particular factor to bring it in a bit closer into the factor that's important? I'll give you an example, Owen, if I may, which is that sleep is often an interesting one, where some people will say that's something I have control over, and it becomes very close to the important factor in the middle. Some people say I have literally no control over how much sleep I have and they place it far away. So we can have a good discussion then about how they might be able to have an influence over sleep and maybe bring that a bit closer in. But certainly this map where you start to think about some of the factors that have an impact on your health, well-being, or performance, and map that out and start to think about how you can bring some of those factors that are important to you closer to the middle by exerting greater control over them is a useful exercise. It's gone down well across different settings, from sport to healthcare through to education. I'd just like to say one thing about control as well, just because, like lots of psychological factors, there's a bit of a Goldilocks effect that goes on, in terms of too little, too much, and the right spot in the middle. And in terms of stress, the one thing I would say about control is that, in general, people who have perceptions of control over their skills or aspects of the situation will typically have a more adaptive stress response. So, if you remember, feelings of uncertainty, lack of control, these all contribute to a less adaptive stress response. However, for individuals who have an external locus of control, in particular high stress situations, that might be quite helpful, particularly where there's lots of uncertainty. I'll give you an example. So if, for example, some of the listeners might be religious, that they might believe that actually, it'll be God's will in terms of what will happen, then in a highly uncertain situation, that can be quite an adaptive or helpful stress response, because you're succeeding control to a higher authority. And there's data that shows that individuals who have sort of, an external locus of control in highly uncertain situations, that can actually lead to a more adaptive stress response. So, like lots of things, there's nuance in terms of the data, and there might be some circumstances where actually having an external locus of control in something like God or a religion might be helpful. But in general, the data would show that individuals with perceptions of control or high perceptions of control would typically have a more adaptive stress response.
I think what you're saying is that that can be like a confidence thing. If you're very confident in your abilities, sometimes even maybe more confident than you should be. I think that's what you're saying. Is that right? How does confidence play into this?
Yeah. Oh, and it's a good point. And perhaps I should have made it clearer, actually, that when we talk about demands in a stressful situation, that we're really talking about resources. And we've talked a bit about control. Perceptions of control is one of those resources. In the work that we've done, confidence is another particularly important resource. Social support can be an important resource as well. But going back to confidence, if we think about confidence in what is an important question, and being confident in being able to execute the skills that I need, or being able to manage the situation, being confident in my ability to regulate my emotions. Quite a lot of people will often get nervous or anxious about being anxious or nervous. So they lack confidence in their ability to regulate their emotions. So confidence covers lots of aspects, both in terms of the skills itself, but also in terms of our own self-regulatory skills. But the broad idea that actually, if we think about stress as being demands, things out there in the environment, then what are our resources that help us manage those particular demands?
So just to summarize, just to make sure that I fully understand this, which has been hugely helpful, thank you, is this kind of pathway of stress is you have the demands and pressures or threats, you have your own unique sense or perception of that, and there are many factors that play, and then there's your own unique sense of control over your ability to manage that, and some of that is personality, confidence, resources, social. And I presume then if you feel that you don't have control over the demands, that's when the feelings of stress occur. And if they persist for a long period of time, I presume that is the chronic feelings of stress and the impacts of that. Is that roughly, have I got that right?
Yeah, so I think, certainly if you don't have the resources to manage the demands that you're faced with, and repeatedly over time, you're spot on, you're going to lead into these chronic stress, McEwen called the allostatic load, repeated activation of the stress response, the wear and tear on the body, the link between chronic stress, which we know, and obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke. So we can see the negative health consequences that occur from chronic stress.
So you hear a lot about modern life stresses, and they're kind of unique. I presume there's some unique challenges. How does modern life uniquely influence this pathway?
If we think about the demands, what are the different demands that we have that we might not have had sort of 20, 30 years ago? If I give you an example from perhaps the world of work, um, so there's a nice report from the Resolution Foundation that talks about people saying that their work is increasingly busy, and that it is more busy than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I can remember that from doing some work in the healthcare system, that people would say, actually, the work is no more difficult now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. It is just the pace of it has changed. It is just busier. And so I think the pace of modern life is something that is a demand. The use of technology, this is where I think stress becomes fascinating. It is both a resource, so modern technology, being able to access emails on the go, being able to contact our friends, you know, whenever we want, being able to check up the latest news when it will flash up on your phone. These are all great resources to be able to stay on top of things, but also simultaneously demands. So I think that's where stress is really interesting, because what can be helpful for us at a particular time can also become a demand for us at another time. And so I'm fascinated by that balance between demands and resources, and when things become a stressor versus something that becomes actually something helpful for us in managing some of those stresses. So, the flexibility that we have around technology, be able to access, work brilliant for those of us who might be managing busy lives or more flexible working lives, but actually juggling a flexible work and home life is in and of itself a stressor as well. So I think there are some interesting perceptions of modern life. But if you said, what is the particular challenge? I think it's the pace of it and the volume of information and access to information that we have to deal with it. Now, I don't think I'll be unique in saying that.
And I presume as well that modern life has probably affected our sense of control as well. Has that changed us in any way?
I mean, one thing that might be an illustrative example of this would be social media. I have a good friend of mine who say, no, social media is not real life. That's the important thing to remember. But if we think about we talked about culture, we talked about where we might have an understanding of how we might manage and cope with stress, that often the images that we might see on social media might be sanitized versions of both people's lives and people's abilities. And of course, if we're seeing sanitized versions of people's lives and their abilities, that can potentially have an impact on our perception of our ability to manage some of those stresses. So, if we see that everybody's coping really well, or everybody's managing positively in those situations, then that might make us feel a little bit insecure in terms of our abilities. Not always. Social media has had some great examples of people talking about some of the challenges they face, but in general, then it can present a more sanitized, for public consumption view of people's lives.
Okay, so that leads on nicely then to what we can do about it. First off, quick question: how do we know if we are stressed? Um, should we test ourselves, or is it just your gestalt? You know when you have the feelings of being stressed.
Well, we talked a bit about modern life. I guess there might be an element of stress is ubiquitous for lots of people. I've talked about some of the responses, the changes in muscular tension, butterflies in the stomach, dry mouth, Those are acute stress responses. In terms of our more chronic stress symptoms, what might be indicative of being stressed over a long period of time, a good measure is actually sleep. So some of the work that we've done in sport and military populations, it's actually a good gateway to get people to identify some aspects of stress that might be going on in their life. So when people, if we measure sleep and we get some data that shows people aren't sleeping well, often that might link into some aspect of chronic stress or some aspect that might be worth talking about or addressing. So sleep and measuring sleep is an interesting way. Thinking about some of our lifestyle behaviors, we know that under stress, people are much more likely to crave, um, high calorie foods, sweet foods, not having time for things that we typically have enjoyed in the past. So changes in behavior, changes in diet, changes in sleep might be good indications of chronic stress, as might be some of our social connections, not having time for those people that are important to us, or perhaps being a bit short with some of those people when we do interact with them, because we've got so many things going on in our minds. So those are good indicators of chronic stress.
Okay, so let's talk about what we can actually do about some of this. So we're going to talk very, very broadly. I think this is just for the general kind of population managing more chronic life stressors. And I know there's a lot of variability, but just looking at some general principles that might be helpful to most people in most circumstances. I think I like the little pathway that you have. If we go through each of those individually, if we start with the threats and demands themselves, is there anything that we can do to kind of improve how we manage those?
Yeah, so I think the first step is probably just to identify and be self-aware about what some of those stresses, some of those demands, some of those threats might be. And I think that's a helpful starting point. And I think there are some occasions where it is not possible to change or to remove yourself from those um, particular threats or demands. Sometimes it might be. Sometimes it might be possible to say, well, actually, I find that quite stressful. I don't think it's important for me, but I might, I don't have to do that. But identifying what those stresses and demands are is a great starting point, because what that then enables you to do is to think about, well, okay, if those are the demands that I'm faced with, how can I build up my resources to enable me to cope with those demands? And then that really takes us into lots of those things that we've talked about in terms of perceptions of control, the confidence, the skills, what social support can I draw on? How might I perceive my response differently in that situation, change my perception of that particular situation from what I think about it now to something that's more positive and more adaptive. So that self awareness about the demands, identifying those leads us into the resources then.
And you mentioned creating like a little diagram. Is that helpful? Do you think a good starting point for some people is really to get down on paper? Like I don't know if a little bit of a self-analysis is quite helpful, like looking through some of the key pillars of life. What are things that are likely to be causing me stress? Identifying what it is that might be causing you stress, and then working out which of those you have control and which you don't. And then maybe even can you even then start to create some actions for some of them? Is that kind of helpful?
I think it's helpful actually. You've given a really nice illustration of how that can be done. I mean, interestingly, there's lots of good evidence to show that writing down your worries or your stresses is a really good way of coping with them. So if you think about what are our emotional um, worries and concerns, then actually writing down some of those worries and concerns um, helps process and reflect on some of those worries, concerns, stresses. And lots of good research has shown that writing down what you're concerned about is a really good way of managing and dealing with stress. So it's twofold. First of all, it's a great way to visualize it and to think about how you might manage and cope with it. But the act as well of writing down about your worries and concerns is helpful in and of itself.
So next on the pathway is that perception thing. I guess people can perceive things as a demand or a threat differently, like you said. So is there anything we can do to improve kind of how we perceive these demands?
Yeah, so I've talked a bit about some of the specific resources that play an important role. Um, I think it's also worth mentioning as well that general lifestyle and general mental health plays an important role here as well. So, if I just give an example from sleep, there was a really nice study that Matthew Walker spoke about in his book on sleep, where he had two groups of people, one of whom they were allowed to have more than 6 hours sleep in a night, the other group that they kept awake all night, so they had no sleep. They then put them into an fMRI, a brain scanner, to look at brain activity and showed them some threatening images. And what they found was that those individuals who had no sleep, the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's involved in sort of fear and emotional processing, was 60% more active compared to those individuals who'd had at least 6 hours sleep that night. So it's a good illustration of how sleep deprivation might have an impact on a biological level on our the way that we make sense and perceive particular stimuli in the environment. So it's just worth mentioning that some of our lifestyle factors might play an important role. Being connected socially to those around us is also an important factor, so that when we feel connected to people, we have both emotional support, but also practical and informational support that enable us to deal with the demands and view those demands differently. A very trite example that I can relate to, having your washing machine break down and leak all over the floor, which is a stressor. I mean, it's a minor stressor, but knowing that you're able to call on a friend or a family member who is able to advise or even fix the washing machine for you makes your stress response less than if you're on your own and you're a bit like me, not very good at doing DIY. So it's a bit of a trite example, but it illustrates how our response to a stressor might be different depending on whether we have that social support or whether we don't. We've done quite a lot of research as well on people's engagement with nature and being connected to the world around us. And that's an important element in terms of reducing our general stress levels that might then have an impact on the way in which we perceive some of the demands that we're faced with. So, nature works on two different potential mechanisms. One is stress reduction theory. So, simply being in nature, viewing nature, reduces our stress levels. It also, because of the soft fascination, the fractal patterns that we see in the nature, it draws our attention in a way that is not cognitively demanding. So it enables us to restore our attentional resources. And so we feel better able to cope with some of the demands afterwards if we've been engaged or close to nature. And there's some really good evidence that people function cognitively better when they live close to nature or when they go into nature. And that's some of the work that we've done here has explored that. So engagement with nature, social support, good sleep, these lifestyle factors are important in more generally our perception and managing our stress levels.
The next little step on the pathway is, I guess, is that control thing. And you hear this a lot, focus on the things you can control, and there's no point worrying about the things you can't control, etc., etc. So, again, just generally, broadly, what can I do to improve or handle better my sense of control over some of these demands?
So I think identifying what factors you can control is helpful. I can remember that there were some really nice examples. Sorry to go back to sport again, but there'll be examples of athletes the day before a competition writing down what the challenges they're going to face and how they're going to cope with that as a strategy to identify what they can control. So this is what's going to happen. These are the things I'm going to face. This is how I'm going to deal with what I'm about to face. So writing things down can be helpful. Sometimes we might want to write. If you've got lots of things that we have to do, lists can be helpful. My wife has an inordinate amount of lists of things that we have to do. But I think more broadly, it's about identifying what is it that we can control in terms of our lifestyle, behaviors, and skills. And I think, in terms of being able to manage stress, a good question to ask ourselves is, what is it that I enjoy doing? What is it that enables me to rest and to recover and to recharge? Because there's a paradox that actually, often when we become under stress, when we have a very busy workload, we have lots of things going on in our life, maybe some difficult things to deal with, it feels trite, or it feels a little bit frivolous to take time off to do the things that I enjoy doing. Whereas paradoxically, it is the very time when you're busy at work, when you have lots of things going on or difficult things to deal with, that you should make time to do the things that you enjoy, that enable you to rest and recover. I don't want to overemphasize that point, but I often see that in lots of people, whether in corporate settings, whether they're in other settings, that they will stop doing the things that they enjoy doing because they are busy. But it is the things that they enjoy doing that will enable them to rest and recover and function even better at the difficult, demanding jobs that they have. The other lifestyle factors I mentioned, sleep, also breath control and being able to regulate breathing, whether that's doing some mindfulness, whether that's doing some meditation, whether that's doing some relaxation. Some people find that helpful. Other people like to be more actively engaged in activities, but being able to sort of regulate your breath and your breathing is an important relaxation strategy for some people. So lots of things that go on that you think about, well, what can I control? Because if you can control your breathing, you can regulate your physical state in a difficult, demanding situation. If I can control and make sure my sleep is good, then I'm much more likely to respond in a more positive way to some of the demands that I see in a subsequent day. Similarly, if you've taken time out to rest and recover through nature or exercise or whatever it might be, you're in a better position to manage the demands and the stresses that you're faced with. And so I think what I'm trying to say here, Owen, is probably to control two things. One of which is lifestyle, so that the readiness for the stressor is, you're in a better position to manage the stressor when it happens. And then the skills that enable you to cope with the stressor when it does arrive. So I think those two things are important. Am I, in a sense, putting in place the groundwork to manage the stressor, so in a better position when the stressor arrives? And do I have the skills to cope with those two things I think are important?
Now, something you hear a lot about is resilience. Oh, you just need to be more resilient, etc. Can you help me understand what exactly is resilience and what can I do to be more resilient?
Like lots of concepts in psychology, when resilience can mean different things to different people. And I think sometimes in the workplace, some people feel it has been weaponized a bit, that the problems are because you are not resilient enough, not because of the working practices or conditions that you are facing. So I am conscious of that. When we do our research and when we've worked with people in demanding occupations, we've conceptualized resilience from a performance perspective. So we said it's about people's ability to perform at an accepted level under duress. So perform at a good level under duress to achieve the things that they want to do, but also to recognize as well that resilience can involve responses to demanding or difficult situations, and how we can rest and recover and get ready to go again after we've had a difficult or demanding uh, event. So it's about performance. Some people emphasize about the ability to bounce back or to recover from that, and I think that's an important element of it as well. So resilience is really all of the things that we've spoken about today. It is the skills and the strategies and the techniques that we've spoken about that can help us become a bit more resilient. We recognize, of course, that there are lots of life events, that there'll be biological differences across people, that people will have had different experiences, but there are skills that people can learn and can develop to become more resilient, which if we take it as being able to respond positively to stress, getting good sleep, working on those social connections, thinking about how we might better be able to control some of the situations that we find ourselves in, making sure that we engage in some of those things that enable us to rest and recover well. So everything we spoke about, Owen, is really contributing to greater resilience.
So I presume work is for a lot of people one of the greatest contributors to life stress. I would presume for the majority. It feels that way in our household. And I know that's one of your particular areas of interest. So if you don't mind, we'll just spend a little bit of time talking specifically about work. Is work stress a necessary byproduct, or is it something that we should be taking more seriously?
It's a good question, Owen, because I've spent a little bit of time just talking about how stress can be both a challenge and a threat. And so I think, good stress, the challenge type, the eustress, work can give us meaning, it can give us a purpose. And so I think whenever we do anything that we think matters, has meaning, has purpose, there can often be stressors and demands associated with that. So I think we certainly wouldn't want it to be negative, but we can recognize stress as being probably an expected part of work to greater or lesser degrees. I know that you'd work in a demanding occupation yourself. So I think I would see work stress as being present and that we want to see it as a challenge and that more positive stress response. What I think is interesting, though, is that when you look at the data that, and I mentioned the report earlier with the Resolution Foundation, that it talks about work becoming busier than it has been in the past. And I think that's something that we should bear in mind. For lots of us as well, our ability to disconnect and switch off from work has become harder. So that demarcation between work and home has become blurred. That might be for lots of reasons. It might be because we are able to access all our work on the handheld device that we have in our pocket a lot of the time. Some people do work from home increasingly now, certainly since COVID, and that remote and flexible working has led to a change in working practices. And when we work from home, being able to demarcate our work life from our home life becomes more challenging. So I think, you know, it's a normal and necessary part of it, but it's certainly something that needs to be managed so that it doesn't become distressing for the individuals involved.
So, in terms of just some broad principles, again, there's so much variability, but in terms of broadly, what can an individual do if they feel chronically stressed within the work that they do?
I mean, everything we've spoken about and talked about some of the strategies for managing chronic stress. There's two things I would say specifically that we haven't mentioned yet, and one of which the PhD student, Megan McGraw, doing some really nice work around job crafting. Job crafting is where we think about the work that we do, and is there a way within what I'm expected to do to shape that job to things that I'm particularly interested in? So, what autonomy do I have? For some people, they will have very little autonomy at all. For others, they may have some ability to shape their work into their interests. So they do more of the things that they enjoy doing. Some of that might be immediate. Some of that might be, well, look, I really want to go down a particular path. And so I will start to do these things that will take me down that route. So that really plays into the perceptions of control and sense of control that we mentioned, that we take some autonomy, control over our work and craft it to something that we think is more in line with what we want. I think the second thing I'd like to mention as well is work can become all encompassing and all consuming sometimes for us. And we forget that at the heart of work are people. And a really nice question, I think I mentioned him already. Martin Turner did the control group, but we were doing some work again. This was in healthcare settings, and we had a really nice task that Martin did where he spoke about ask people the question, when was the last time that you had a conversation with somebody you work with that wasn't about work? And because work is busy, we often just end up talking about work all the time, quite rightly. But those social connections that are important for stress in our life matter in work as well. We look back to some of the data that we collected on sports teams. We used to think that so long as a sports team was task focused, that they were focused on a specific task, then that was all that we needed that team to be cohesive around a task. But actually, teams that are socially connected also do better as well. And those social connections in work are important because people are at the core of any workplace. And when we feel socially connected to the people that we work with, we will typically perform better. So those are the two things I would talk about. Craft your job in a particular way plays into that sense of control. And when's the last time you had a conversation with someone at work that wasn't about work? Because that can help build those social connections.
For those that work from home and maybe they've lost that separation between work and home life, how can we manage that a little better?
It's a good question. And of course, there are going to be individual differences across both people and the types of roles that they do. But certainly that ability to switch off and disconnect. We've collected large scale survey data that shows that, individuals who access their emails during their leisure time are greater risk of lower mental health. So that ability to disconnect and find time to rest and recover, I think, is important. Some people like the flexibility that it brings, and that's where the challenge comes in. So it becomes a very individual factor. But I think in general, I mean, email is asynchronous. We treat it as it should be an immediate conversation, whereas it really is just a message that doesn't have to be responded to immediately. Interestingly, when we send more emails, we get more emails back. So it's one of those tasks that you can never get to the bottom of sometimes. We think that we clear our email inbox by sending an email, but then of course people will respond back. So having set times of the day where we pick up email would make sense. If you're dealing with email perhaps out of hours, it's possible to set up the email so you can write the email and send it, but it doesn't get delivered until the following day. So it means that you won't get a response back. There are lots of ways of handling that people can use, and it would differ across each individual. But I think the broad concept that you would want to find time to switch off and disconnect is something that we see coming through in our research.
Now, what can the company themselves do? I mean, what comes into my head is the Google offices. That was quite unique in the day when there was like pool tables and places to go and rest and meditate. And presumably that feeds into a happier workforce, productivity, all of that stuff. But just generally speaking, presuming not all companies can put pool tables in their offices, what are some of the things that companies should be conscious of and maybe try to do to support better mental health and less stress in the workplace?
I think one of the challenges the companies have is work can be demanding and there will be stresses associated with it. But certainly to demonstrate and illustrate through actions that they care about the health of their workforce. And there are many things that we could talk about. But if I give just two quick examples. So we spoke about emails and being connected out of people working out of hours and not disconnecting. There are some workplaces that have set up their service so that emails do not get sent out of working hours. So that's a nice example of how we could say, look, we don't mind you working, but you're not going to be connecting to other people within the workplace out of normal working hours. The other thing to mention perhaps is that when we look at the data, that we see that the biggest potential source of negative stress for people in the workplace is their line manager. And that when they have a good line manager, they will tend to have a positive mental health and a positive psychological state about work. So putting in good training for line managers, good support for line managers to look after the people that they're managing and to have in place robust systems for dealing with situations where that relationship is sort of not functioning as well as we'd like. And thinking back to the pathway, if we think about what's important, certainly not overburdening the staff in terms of the workplace demands they're faced with, but then giving them the skills and the autonomy, that sense of control to be able to manage where it's appropriate their work demands. So broadly ensuring then that they have the right skills to be able to do their job. We talked about confidence as being one of the big resources. Certainly perceptions of control only matter if you have the skills to be able to execute what you need to do at a particular time. So I think in not overburdening individuals with too many work demands, giving that sense of control, autonomy to be able to do their work and certainly have the skills to be able to do that correctly.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones. This has been really a fascinating conversation. Any little final kind of parting comments you would like to make?
I think the only thing I'd like to say, and thanks very much for inviting me on. I've really enjoyed it, Owen. Is when people talk about managing stress, they often talk about thinking about what they should do in the moment to manage it. I am feeling stressed. What should I do? And I think it's helpful to think about stress, both chronic and acute, in terms of managing stress by being prepared for it. So those lifestyle things that we spoke about, what helps us rest and recover, good sleep, being connected to other people, whatever it might be for any particular individuals. I think that's important. And then you're into managing the stress as it occurs in the moment. But there are two aspects to it. And people often talk about managing stress in the moment and forget about the being prepared, putting in the good foundations that make it that your stress response is likely to be less intense or not at all, rather than try to manage it from moment to moment.
Professor Jones, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Owen.